for joining us today. This is a discussion to learn from you in your journeys moving from craft-based occupations to evidence-based professions. This discussion is based on research that have been taken as part of a wider action research titled Implementing Transformation in Police Learning and Development. It's conducted by the Open University Police Center for Policing Research and Learning, and we are working in close collaboration with Meyer Office for Policing and Crime, the MOPAC. I would start by asking you to introduce yourself. What were your roles over the professionalization of your professions?
So I'm Dr. Stephen O'Brien, currently the Dean of the Faculty of Health and Society at the University of Northampton. And I started out in the nursing profession in 1978. So by professional background, I'm an adult and a mental health nurse.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Dr. Elise Martin, and I'm the Director for the Implementing Transformation Police Learning and Development. And my background is in criminology, but I have worked with the police service in relation to education and leadership for the last 15 years.
Thank you very much.
And I'm Bob Fellows. I'm Head of Education for the College of Paramedics and started off in the ambulance world in 1980, so 38, on my 39th year.
What do you mean by professionalization? How it applies in your area of work?
My interpretation of what professionalisation means is that there is a recognised, I think, set of criteria that you can apply to any occupation that makes it a profession. So classically you would say that the members of that profession would be educated, and they would be educated normally to degree level, and that they would have a body of knowledge that was uniquely their own. In reality of practice, you draw on lots of different bodies of knowledge, but actually for nursing we have a body of knowledge which we are creating for ourselves, which is unique to us, through research and through evidence-based practice. And so you also regulate yourself, so you have a means by which you allow people to enter the profession. You have standards against which they have to meet to enter the profession, and then there are standards that you have to maintain your membership, if you like, of that profession. And the professional regulator ensures that if you step out of line, you can be removed from the register and actually removed from the profession. So it's around those broad areas that I would say my definition, if you like, of a profession or professionalisation is all about. And the process by which you get there is the process of professionalisation.
Yes. Bob, is there anything else?
Well, we're fairly new to this journey, less than 20 years, and I don't know that we really understood exactly what we were taking on when we headed off towards registration, CPD, fitness to practice, and it's only more recently that we've actually gained the full graduate education. But broadly speaking, I think it was a sense of we no longer were just ambulance driver and ambulance attendant, and that we actually were starting to build research. Many people are already starting to develop their own specialities. And exactly as Steve has said, all of the things about what makes up a profession, I don't think they're very different between nursing and the ambulance paramedic world. The only thing perhaps we're having to do is we've had to learn from other professions. So we have learned an awful lot from nursing. And I'm hopeful that the police will be able to learn from both the paramedic world and nursing and other professional groups who've undertaken the same journey.
Yeah. Denise?
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with kind of both points, and I think it is about that kind of creating a knowledge base, and particularly, you know, in relation to kind of evidence-based practice is quite critical. You know, the idea about regulation, the idea about kind of education, and I think for policing, I think one of the challenges is that they're only kind of partway on that kind of journey. And I think one of the issues is the term professionalisation sometimes. So I think that is actually what sets a profession out, is those core characteristics that are quite important to define the profession. But sometimes using the term professionalisation is quite a kind of challenging term for them to use, and particularly in relation to policemen, because I think the idea that, well, are we not already a profession? We do a professional job. We provide,
Yes.
you know, a public service. So I think it's about that. But I think in order to sort of progress in relation to, I suppose, enhancing the organisation, the police service, those traits are a requirement, and particularly in relation to the complex jobs that they now do.
Well, thank you very much for this. I move now to try to unpack some aspects of the journey of professionalization. So again, in your area of work, what were the processes of professionalization? What were the main triggers and what were the main critical stages?
2019 is an important year because it's 100 years since the opening of the register within the UK. So back in 1919, the registration process was introduced and the register was introduced. Not for all fields of practice in nursing, it was only for what we call general nursing or what we would now call adult nursing. But very quickly the other fields of practice all joined that register. So in a sense that was probably the first point, because you've now got a regulating body.
Yeah.
There was then probably a very long period where there was some development but very little. Really, when you get into the 1960s and 70s and into the 80s, certainly within the UK, so you see some pressure building from within the profession itself. Rosemary White's work talks about generalists and professionalists and educationists, and those latter two groups really came together to sort of form a bit of a momentum within the profession, within nursing itself. And then really, I suppose there are some sort of key landmark moments. One of the landmark moments certainly would be the publication of something called A New Preparation for Practice, which was Project 2000.
Yeah.
That was published in 1986. And what that did was it said actually there was a need for an academic qualification. So up until that point, nurses did their training. It was very much an apprenticeship style training within the NHS. And what this did, once it was adopted and became policy and was implemented, meant that nursing education moved into the higher education sector. So we became part of universities. Universities awarded those diplomas. Eventually that became an all-graduate profession in the 1990s. And you know, they are the sort of key moments, I would say, in terms of where we've got to now. A more modern moment probably would be the last outcome of the Research Excellence Framework, that assessment exercise that happens in universities, where for the very first time we started to see nursing departments providing good research that was being assessed at a nationally recognised and internationally recognised level. And who knows what the next step might be, what the next key moment might be.
Thank you. Bob, what was the reasons or the triggers behind starting the professionalization in paramedics?
It's very tricky to actually point to one individual trigger or one event, but we know that we had standardised training to some extent through from 1966, and in 1985 we had a national extended training scheme to train what we now call a paramedic. That was at that stage a very American term, and it was perhaps shunned by the UK market. And we'd gone through a very nasty, drawn-out dispute. It wasn't ever actually a strike, but it was an industrial dispute in 89-90, where it was interesting things that came out of the Hansard reports and things in government, where trying to define what is a paramedic, who is a paramedic, how many did we actually have, and quite dismissively a few people said they're just glorified taxi drivers.
Yeah.
And I think it rankled with ambulance staff and people who were extended trained, myself included in that, who felt that no, we're much more than just glorified taxi drivers. And we tried to define it. So through the 90s we were exploring the value of the education of what became a paramedic, talking to universities in the UK, such as Hertfordshire, that were one of the pioneers in this work. And from that came a position where we had the very first graduate programme set up in 1998 for direct entries. And that, through 98, 99, caused ripples across the country where people started to talk about a voluntary register and could we actually join the CPSM, who are now known as the HCPC. And we had a vote, and right across the nation, there was only about 8,000 paramedics in that era, and there was a big majority who wanted to go down that path, and by the year 2000 we joined the register. Did we know exactly what we were taking on? Probably not.
Yeah.
But I think today people wouldn't turn it back because it is there to protect the public. That's what its primary reason was for registration. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the key triggers, and there's been a number of big publications that came out in and around that era, things like Taking Healthcare to the Patient and others, documents of that era, Life in the Fast Lane, that actually set us down a path where we could be more than what we were currently doing. And also we never felt that we owned our own professional status. I don't mean to be disrespectful because my daughter's a doctor, but doctors felt that they had a massive say in what happened in the ambulance world. Today, with a professionalisation, we've stepped into having our own autonomy, we've stepped into having our own independence, we have our own publications, our own journals, we have our own research, and we don't want to work as a silo, we don't want to be on our own, but we do want to work with our own setting of what is really important for us, at the same time working as a team across healthcare. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think we wouldn't turn the clock back, but we learned lots of lessons on the route.
We will come to these lessons in a minute, but Denise, reflecting in both journeys and the triggers behind them, now the police seems to is going through a very similar route. Do you have any reflections on that, and what do you think about the beginning of the policing, especially in the project that we are in at the moment, implementing transformation, police learning and development? Massive part of what we are doing is helping and supporting departments of learning and development in the police to cope with these changes.
I think if you actually look at sort of policing as a profession, that the idea of professionalisation is actually quite not new. So if you look historically, it's something that, you know, particularly there's kind of key literature that looks at attempts at professionalisation in policing, so it's not necessarily something that's just happened. I think it's going back to the previous point, it's become much more formalised, and I think that's been kind of driven really by the establishment of the College of Policing, who were seen as, I suppose, an independent sort of body for the police. And since, particularly in England and Wales, I think the emergence of the College of Policing as a driver towards the police qualifications framework and making the police a graduate profession, I think it's been a big trigger towards kind of making some of the issues around, you know, evidence-based practice more formalised. But again, it's not like it didn't exist in the past. I think it's just a shift in the journey, and it's by bringing a graduate profession and making that kind of mandatory, I think that has been a key driver to then look at, you know, I suppose the workforce across the board, and to think about that broader professionalisation piece. So I think that's a kind of key driver. I think also there's kind of broader policing strategies. So if you look at Policing Vision 2025, I think that's been a big, you know, driver towards workforce transformation kind of for the police particularly. And within that document, it outlines obviously the complexities of the police role and what police are currently held, and that shift in policing because of new types and forms of criminality, different types of criminality. So you could use cybercrime as an example, and that realisation that actually the workforce needs new or different skills to be able to deal with those complexities. So I think, you know, that there's been triggers because of I suppose the different challenges now that the organisation are facing. So it's not like professionalisation didn't exist or that evidence-based. There's police journals, for example, that already exist. There's higher education, you know, higher education institutions and police partnerships that have existed for a number of years. So they're not new, but I think it's just the formalisation has happened because of, you know, things like the establishment of the College of Policing and drivers like Policing Vision 2025 and working towards that, and the realisation that actually we need to equip our staff in an appropriate manner to support them to achieve the goals of the organisation.
May I ask now about the key stakeholders? So I understand that the process was a collaboration between you as professionals. Who else was taking part in this process and what their roles were?
So for nursing, it was predominantly internally driven. So it would be difficult to identify particular stakeholders outside of the profession.
Yeah.
There was a lot of political lobbying, there was a lot of social lobbying and so on. But I think the growth, if you like, in terms of the need to move towards professional status was very much coming from nursing itself. I talked about Rosemary White's work earlier. Those groups of people who were, if you like, categorised in the professionalist or in the educationist categories grew. But that's not to say that there weren't people actually within nursing who actually it didn't really matter to them. They would have been the generalists.
Yeah.
But they get brought along, if you like. Once you start to get that momentum, it's inevitable that you're going to shift in a particular way. So the generalists will go with you eventually. But there will always be some resistance within there. So whilst it was very much internally driven, there was also some resistance from within. But I can't really identify any particular stakeholders other than people from within nursing that look at that. I mean, what's interesting at the moment is there's a bit of a debate about those advancing roles, and you become much more specialist and much more advanced, and the education then that sits with that at master's or at doctoral level. And many people sort of construct that as taking on the role that once was a doctor's. And then there are others, and these are the real professional zealots who would say it's not about that at all. We are a profession in our own right, and we're developing in that way anyway. It's not about being a mini doctor. It's about being an advanced practitioner in nursing. So there's still that very strong sense of an internal drive there.
Was it the same in paramedics?
Yes, there was quite a big push from internally within the ambulance world. Because I can't say the paramedic world, because it was at that era of change. It wasn't that paramedical. If you think it was 8,900 came to the register 18 years ago, and today we have 24,600 paramedics. So it's grown immensely. I think some of the key people were things like some of the medical directors of ambulance services were keen to see more and encouraged. And I think once you had that encouragement from some of the medics and some of the wider other professions saying you could do more. I had a conversation with a nurse back in the mid-90s, about 93, 94, who said, what is a paramedic education worth? And I sort of said, what do you mean? And they said, well, if you were taking your course, what would it be worth in academic terms? No one had ever asked me that before. And so you started to explore that and think, so if I wanted to top that up to a degree, it just was those early triggers around us. There was other professions as well, nurses, doctors, and also keen, enthusiastic chief executives, people like Ken Wenman, David Whitmore, who were pushing away in the background to say, we can do this, and actually became founder people of the sort of the original registration group that actually put the voluntary register together and helped to drive us on. And I think also the development of nursing into specialisms advanced, that's a path we're on at the moment. Always we were in generalist ambulance work, and that's where you build your primary base. You go out and you deal with whatever comes as undifferentiated care to treat and look after and support. And then people are starting to say, well, I want to specialise in primary care only, or I want to specialise in critical care, or maybe mental health or paediatrics. And then today we have independent prescribing, where people are starting to take on the ability to be able to write the scripts and actually issue for medicines and so on. And that comes usually at an advanced level role. And with that comes all the levels of the different education. So yes, we've got a primary degree, honours degree is the base of coming in, but we would expect specialisms to start looking at postgraduate diplomas. We'd expect advanced to be at least at master's level, and our consultant paramedics, of which there are about 30 of them across the UK, they would normally be at or working towards a PhD. So there's many parallels that we see in other professions and think, let's not break that, that's working.
Yeah.
So you learn from others as well, and that's what we're doing.
Actually, I'd like to take this, the opportunity here as we are talking about stakeholders, and I would like to hear a little bit more about the relationship between you as a professional, professional bodies, and the regulatory body and the employer. This three pillars of a profession seems to be very important, and it's not yet existing in policing, but I'd like to have a little bit of feedback, reflection about the relationship between these three.
So, the employers of nursing of nurses are the employers. Nurses work for predominantly the NHS
Yes.
in the UK, but also the private, independent, voluntary sector. And the employers essentially will look to the regulator to ensure that the people they employ are fit and sound.
Yes.
And they have the opportunity to report poor practice or unsafe practice to the regulator. But the regulator, in essence, regulates the profession. There's an interesting relationship, I think, in nursing, and it is quite a bit different to paramedic. I'm sure Bob will explain that in a moment. But in nursing, we have something called the Royal College of Nursing, which is a professional body and therefore has a number of professional interest groups, but is also a union.
Yes.
There's some tension in the way that gets played out, I would suggest. Whereas we have the Nursing and Midwifery Council, which is the regulator. But in a way, they are the regulator and also the standard setter. So whilst the Royal College of Nursing might influence the debate around how the standards are generated, how they're set, it is the Nursing and Midwifery Council that sets the standard, sets the educational standards, and therefore will require the universities to meet those standards in order to deliver the degree programmes to bring the next generation of nurses on. The regulatory element of it is also then that if you like, the policing, if I could use that term, the sort of policing, if you like, of the profession. So the removal of people from the register, allowing people, holding the register, making sure that those standards are applied. So, and that is quite unique, I think, for nursing. It's a bit different in what I would call the allied health professions, of which paramedic is one.
We have the Health and Care Professions Council, who are the regulator, as Steve has said, and there's a number of professions that work under their wings, if you like, the sort of protection. But as I said earlier, they are there to protect the public. They're not there to protect the individual. If you do something that's not right, you normally go down two potential routes. One is about conduct, and conduct is a more serious offence than if you make an error. So if I do something that's silly, it's something to do with I should have known better, I could be educated, then that doesn't normally remove me from the register. That normally gives me extra training and support and development. But if I'm a liar or a cheat, or I'm going to do wrong things to people and hurt people deliberately, or then that's conduct, and that can cost me my registration and can cost me my job and career. The professional body sits away from that. We are not a union. We have no ambitions or intentions to become a union. That would have been a serious problem to existing trade unions and staff side representations within the ambulance world if we had tried to do that.
So I'm going to move now to the benefits of professionalization. We have touched on this slightly before, but I would like to have them, to listen to them more articulated. Why nursing, why paramedics took the journey, which was few decades in each case, to move from craft-based to evidence-based and to be professionalized. What are the benefits that you can share with us now?
So I would suggest that when nursing started off on its professionalisation journey, I think there was a sense of intuition that this has got to be good for everybody, and not just good for the profession itself. And I think there can be a criticism levelled perhaps at professions where it is very much internally driven, that actually this is all about you and your status, etc., etc. But when you think about all of those other criteria that I talked about earlier, that unique body of knowledge, that development of research, the evidence-based practice and so on and so forth, and the educational development that runs alongside that, there are some very clear benefits for the most important people in all of this, and that is the general public and the patients that are either nursed in hospitals or in communities or in GP practices, or indeed the patients that Bob and his colleagues deal with on site at road traffic accidents or in their own homes and so on. And that's about outcome. And that's about patient outcomes. And there is a wealth now of independently validated research from across the world, United States, Australia, and a very strong set of pan-European research which indicates that actually with that development of education and the development of the profession, particularly to a graduate level, that actually patient outcomes are better. So if, for example, you go into a surgical ward, you are more likely to come out alive after your operation if you are nursed by graduates. And we know that there is a very strong correlation between the number of people who are working in that clinical setting and the proportion of graduates that would be working in that team. So you're less likely to have complications. If you do have complications, they're more likely to be picked up early intervention, and therefore you get better outcomes. And that has got to be the biggest single reason as to why anybody would want to do this. And if I think about the journey that the police are on, I would again say to them, this is really about outcomes. It's about what are you trying to achieve within your profession in terms of that relationship with the public and the way in which crime is developing and becoming more complex. The likelihood is that by developing your profession and getting that graduate status, you are more likely to be able to achieve those outcomes, and therefore the general public benefits from it.
I think the very fact that we've trebled in numbers in less than 20 years as paramedics says there's a demand for us. I think the fact that the employment section is now looking to say, well, can we have you working in our GP practice? Can we have you working in the urgent care or into the emergency department? Could you come and work in forensics, or could you come and work for the police service, or could you work in a prison service? Is that they're a very useful commodity, and that has been built around better training and education, better research, a wider scope of practice. We wouldn't have got independent prescribing last year without having gone down this pathway. Yes. The quantity of CPD that paramedics achieve today to build a portfolio that's properly audited and assessed every 2 years. When I joined, there was nothing. I mean, literally 20 plus years ago, if you had 2 days of mandatory statutory training within your employment, that was the standard, that was what you got. Today, paramedics are on research, they're on conferences, they're reading journals, they're developing, and they question, why am I doing that? Why do I give that drug? Is this right? Is that, and also we learn from others, so that even on a fitness to practice case, if somebody has done something that's a bit silly, a bit, I'm not talking about conduct, a little competency thing, how can we develop that? How can we learn from that? And that has become the learning culture. That paramedics today are sponges. They really, really want to know more. It's no longer the you're not just going to unload the patient at the A&E department. I want to know what the outcome is. I want to know how that person got on. And people trust us. We're covering more calls today than we've ever covered in the whole ambulance world. And all sorts of strategies to try and reduce call rates. But actually, people trust us enough that they want a paramedic there. And it's a growth market, and I'm proud to say I'm a paramedic. And the very fact that my father was in the ambulance service and my son's a paramedic, we must be doing something right where I didn't manage to put him off. So it's a good thing.
Denise, thinking about this benefits, how you would reflect on this when it comes to policing?
Well, I think that's, for me, quite the important part is making the police a kind of learning culture, embedding that learning, but also for the end goal. So I think, you know, the way we've conceptualised it through this project, I think one of the challenges is that police degrees have been around in different ways in different places, but we don't have the evidence at the moment, the evidence base to suggest they're making it better outcomes. And I think that's one of the things, as I said before, that we have to do. But I think the benefits for policing is, I think it's just that individual where we're investing in the individual, we're giving them the skills and the knowledge that they need to do the job. So I think that's one part of it. It benefits the organisation because you have a skilled workforce who are then more independent, able to make decisions. So, you know, there's issues around that autonomous kind of organisation, and then that learning organisation. And then I think the final is really, and probably the most important, is that public value. Because it's creating, you know, a service that, you know, is improved for, delivery's improved to communities. And I think that's really important. And I think another piece is actually about working with partners. So, you know, if you look at other public services, you know, so, you know, the police work with health professions, they work with the education, they work with social work, and all those other professions are graduate professions. And actually, really what we're just doing is saying, you know, you're on the same level with them, so you deserve to be rewarded for that. So you are all on the same sort of level, and you're able also to, you know, deliver and have that broader outcome to the public. But we're also investing in you, and I think that's really kind of critical to get across that message that by investing in people, you're investing more broadly in the outcomes in communities. It's what I would say would be the lessons that I think we can learn from the paramedics and nursing.
So may I ask now about the biggest challenges you faced and you had to deal with over this process? We see that the benefits are valued and they're worth the effort, but what were the biggest challenges that you had to deal with?
Should I start on that one? Because I'd say it's communication. Getting the message across without coming across that everyone else is useless and hopeless and you all need to get up to speed with the rest of us. That is not the message, but it can easily be misinterpreted. Oh, you want us all to have a degree now, do you? Why? What's wrong with what I'm doing? Are you saying I'm not very good at my job? Those are the sort of the kickback messages that came across. And we probably, in hindsight, didn't spend enough time selling what we were trying to achieve, and we were too quick to come up with the solution without showing the workings out, if you like, from a mathematics point of view. And I think that's been an error, and I think even today there are a few people who are sort of die-hard resistors to, you know, this job's all about practical hands-on. It's not about, you know, writing essays and so on. And you still get that. It's all about common sense and, you know, give me someone who's sort of street trained over anyone who's just come straight out of university. It's getting those messages across that it's not pushing one down and lifting one up. It's actually we're all in it together, and that there's a new way, possibly in the future, where we can all drive that forward. And we're not going to dismiss anybody in the paramedic world or nursing or in the police who haven't come through what I've come through, because you also are still learning from that fantastic experience. It's communication and getting the message across and making sure that everybody is all on the same page.
May I ask about the aspects of diversity? Because a big issue with the policing right now is the fear that might touch on some communities and prevent them coming to the police because they are not academically driven or similar, you know.
Let me start with that one, Jen. Then under the graduation program of the graduate profession, prior to 20 years ago, we were a male-dominated white male, and today we have over 50% of the paramedic world is female. We still need to work on diversity. We do reasonably well in the city centres, in the big towns of Manchester, Birmingham, London. We do less well in the rural communities. But if we broke down the statistics of rural communities, it isn't that far off. It is still an ongoing piece of work. We certainly don't exclude anybody by race or creed, but we do encourage. And I suppose there is a higher level to come in if you're looking for people who have got A levels, but we're a broad group who want to have people who come with access programs and who can show experiential learning and draw people in, perhaps who've coming from other professions, they bring with them other talents. That's about marketing yourself well, that's about advertising well, that's about encouraging and having an open mind to it all. And perhaps people in the past thought, oh well, that's just for people of a certain group, and it's breaking that little cycle and getting people in from the whole of the communities that are involved.
Yeah. Can I also just add to that? I think if you look at examples of some kind of European countries, so I think, for example, places like kind of Finland, Scandinavian countries, they've actually found by moving towards a graduate profession in policing that they've increased diversity, particularly again along gendered kind of lines. So they've increased the number of kind of female recruits to introducing graduate professions. And actually there's some suggestion, particularly BME communities, that having a degree is much more valued, and that's actually prevented people from kind of joining the police in the past. So, you know, because they tend to go for kind of the medical or legal profession where they are kind of degree sort of graduate profession. So I think actually the argument about diversity, I think if you start to look at the evidence, I'm not sure that kind of stands up, but I think there is kind of challenges in that with different communities. But I think the important thing about that is if you look at itchy eyes, and part of this is the development of the relationship with itchy eyes, there's a real strength in a number of itchy eyes who will be involved in delivering these kind of police degrees, who actually have a lot of skills in ensuring that they have a diverse range of students and that they support those students. You know, particularly if you look at a number of universities, they have widening participation programmes that encourages and brings students in from different communities. So I don't see why the policing degree process would be any different from that. So I think it's just thinking about also that's what universities can actually provide to support increasing that diversity, because they have a lot of skills and experience in doing that and meeting that agenda.
You're absolutely right. I mean, going back to the sort of original question.
Yes, the challenges.
The challenges, and I'd absolutely agree with Bob. I mean, I think it is about the way in which you communicate, the way in which you get that message across. So, you know, one of the most difficult jobs that I ever had was when I was early in education, where Project 2000 was being implemented, and it was badged as this, you know, people in the future will be knowledgeable doers. And some of the messages that came across within that policy and within that educational change really were not taken very well by the existing workforce, and so the existing workforce felt a bit devalued. We didn't get that piece right. Actually then there were further iterations of the curriculum that moved on from there, which actually swung the pendulum back a little bit. So when we moved into academia, everybody argued it's all too theoretical, it's not practical enough. And so of course you swing one way, then you swing back a little bit, and you probably get to where you need to be. So the next iteration, which was the fitness to practice curriculum, so-called, was a much easier sell to the profession actually, because people could see that it was really appealing, if you like, sort of traditional routes, but also very much professionalising. What's quite interesting about nursing, and I think it is quite unique to the other allied health professions, is we constantly have to justify why we have a degree as our preparation, constantly. And so, and that always comes to the fore at a time of crisis. So I would argue we have a crisis at the moment in the NHS in England, with 45,000 nurses short. We're continually going overseas to bring nurses from Europe and outside of Europe to come and work in the NHS. And yet we still have 45,000 vacancies. And when you get that, then you will get a political pressure in the system to say, well, surely anybody could be a nurse, as long as you're kind and caring and compassionate. Well, you do have to be kind and caring and compassionate, but you have to know your stuff, and you have to be able to justify the actions that you take, and you have to be able to make the right call in very critical moments. Paramedics have to do exactly the same. That moment when they make that decision about leaving somebody at home, or when they decide actually we need to intervene here, or we need to do something else, or to, work through another clinical protocol. Really, really important, because if you get that wrong, it can be disastrous. And so I think there is this constant pressure upon us to be able to justify why it is, and yet there is, as I said earlier, that wealth of evidence that says having a graduate, being educated to a graduate level enables you to actually perform much better and get much better outcomes.
Actually, I'm going to stay with universities and HEIs and try to unpack a little bit the relationship between you as universities, actually you, Steve, as a university, professional body with universities, how you manage this relationship. Would you please give us some insights, some advices about this relationship, how is it managed, and how can the police make the best out of this relationship with universities?
If you are a university with a paramedic program, it's nigh on impossible to do it successfully without having a dialogue with your practice placement providers, whether they are the local ambulance service or other parts of the health economy. There's usually some form of memorandum of understanding or memorandum of cooperation where you can set down some basic tenets of what we're all trying to achieve out of this, and what happens if this happens and what happens there, and the finance and the money and the uniforms and all of these things, who's doing what. So regular meetings with those. I think also that things like the Health and Care Professions Council, they not only have their own standards, they then contract people to come and support them in being education visitors. So people going to look at an approved programme for paramedic will be a team of people, usually an education officer, a paramedic, and usually another, or sometimes two paramedics, who've been trained in that role. So it is almost like, from a police point of view, it would be police officers coming to inspect the police education to make sure that it meets the regulatory body. Even things down like CPD, your CPD isn't assessed by some automaton in an office somewhere. They are paramedics who are assessing other paramedics CPD who've been trained to do that role and check it out. So it's all about connecting, professionalising, being properly prepared for the roles that you're taking on, and where there are tensions, usually it's because one side wants more out of something than the other one can't give at that stage.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. That endorsement is really important. Yeah. It's important for universities because it's also helpful in terms of marketing your programs. Not only have you got the regulator is saying this is okay and the university is saying okay, actually the professional body is saying this is a sound program. It's endorsed by them.
And they look at it from a slightly different angle.
Why wouldn't you want to have that? You know, and we know we can run the program without that endorsement, but actually it's an enhancement to that. So, of course, we will look at it.
Take on board. Yeah.
We're all marketeers these days.
Yes, we are. Didis, would that you think would reflect on how the policing would do their programs? Because I think we know that they are starting their programs from next year. Any of that you think would be a good practice that they can take on board?
I think particularly around the kind of quality of it and having that sort of professional validation, I think is actually kind of quite important. Yeah. And I think that has to be more than from just the College of Policing. I know the College of Policing obviously have kind of informed in terms of what the curriculum might kind of look like, but I think they also kind of need that sort of professional, sort of separate professional body that actually assures the kind of quality of the programme. I think that would be really beneficial, and I think from the structure of the way that nursing and paramedics have been done, that's one thing that actually the police could really learn from, because I think having that separation is quite important, and particularly having that kind of quality and that validation of kind of standards, but from a professional body which is kind of, I suppose bought into, I suppose we go back to communication and buy-in, which is bought into by the profession, and I think that is really essential. And I think really building those relationships, I think because you build those relationships on kind of firm foundations, and I think that's really quite critical, I think, for building strong HEI police relationships is about communication, it's about working together. There will be kind of challenges along the way. I mean, these relationships already exist in some areas, they don't exist in all areas, but there's some good examples of kind of partnerships. I'm kind of mentioned kind of you know, the East Midlands and Northamptons, it's existed for a long time. So I think it's looking also where we can learn, but certainly I think working together. So not having a separation between the police and the HEI, or you know, but really working together. But I think the structure of the way that's done is something actually the police really need to kind of consider and think about moving forward.
That relationship between the employers and the HEI is really important as well. I mean, in a way, you alluded to that. In the East Midlands, we have a fantastic relationship with the police. Actually, we've had a very long-standing relationship with Northamptonshire Police, you know, over 12 years, and you have to invest in that. And it takes time, and it can easily be destroyed, very easily, but you have to keep investing in it. And I think if you do that, then when the times get tough and you have to make difficult decisions, and it's difficult for either partner, it's much easier actually to resolve that and come to a solution. And we've been challenged a lot around the way in which we developed the police constable degree apprenticeship locally. Really big challenges, but actually ourselves in East Midlands and Northamptonshire Police have solved them because there was a willingness on everybody's part to do that, and that is something that doesn't come immediately. You have to work at it.
From your experiences on a personal level, professional level, I mean personally working in the profession, what are the main learning points that you think they are key to share with the police as they are on their journey for professionalisation at the moment?
Get your message right. So we've talked a lot about communication. Michael Fullan talks about the meaning of educational change. It becomes meaningful for people when they understand what it means to them. Not to the profession, but to those individual police officers that are working, you know, as we speak now, keeping us all safe. So I think there's definitely something about communication and getting your message right. I think the relationship building that we've just talked about is another key important point. And I would say, remember that you've got an existing workforce and you need to value that existing workforce and listen to the concerns that they've got and address those concerns. And then I think if you do that, you know, that journey will be a little bit shorter. We didn't invest as much in continuing professional development for the existing workforce that we should have done. We concentrated on getting the entry routes right, and I know that the police are concentrating on getting the entry routes right, but not at the expense of CPD, because otherwise you won't have that workforce that feels valued and is ready to accept these new graduates into the profession. It does take a generation, but it can take a lot longer than that if you don't quite get those bits right. They would be the three key messages, I would say.
Well, you have shared something similar with me.
Well, yes, those three about the communication and in connecting and not forgetting the existing workforce, all of that, absolutely a vital element to it all. I think also, don't be in a rush. I know you've got deadlines. I know someone set some targets and some dates on things, but actually get it right if you possibly can without having to be pushed. I mean, it's a bit like Crossrail. It constantly moves to the next target when the station's going to open, but actually it'll open when it's ready. And I think with the policing, you can't just have it as an indifferent sort of when will it happen, but it needs to be right and it needs to be carefully worked through. I think those are the keyest things, really. I don't want to repeat what Steve has said.
Denise, any final ideas about it?
My idea, I think, based on the sort of panel today, really is, and I think reflects all the existing points about communication, but I think is the length of that journey. And I think one of the things that we've identified is that the police is quite a reactive organisation, And I think there needs to be a realisation that this is a longer term journey. This isn't going to be solved tomorrow.
No.
And an appreciation of that, because this is about cultural kind of change and embedding it within the organisation. That's going to take time. And I think that's, for me, the big communicator, that we can't solve this by next year, we can't solve it by the year after. It may take 10, 15 years for this to be fully realised. And there's going to be sort of different challenges on that journey, but then I think the outcomes in the longer term will be worth the journey.
I mean, we had Project 2000, but we weren't there in 2000. The police have got Vision 2025. They'll be somewhere in 2025, but they won't be at the end point of the journey. Bob's absolutely right. You need to take your time. And if you get all of those other things right, you can shorten it. But sometimes you have to make the mistakes that other professions have made in order to learn from those mistakes to move on. You know, I'll go back. It's taken us 100 years. Well, it's 100 years since we started this process, if you like, with the register. It probably started earlier than that, because Nightingale was probably the very first, if you like, nursing academic that's recognised. But actually she fought against registration, interestingly. But now we're 100 years on, and we're still developing, we're still moving on in exactly the same way as the paramedic profession is moving on. So, you know, you don't have to rush it. And the fact that you've got a vision that says 2025 is a nice line in the sand and a target to get to. But don't beat yourself up if you haven't quite got there. It might take you another 10, 15, 20 years. You will get there.
21 years ago, we started with our first pre-reg graduate programme. Only just before Christmas last year was the first graduate programme in Northern Ireland. They took a little bit longer. Their journey was a little bit more round the houses, but they're there now. And, you know, we're working together to make sure that model is right across the UK, and that we've got standards, we've got a future, and that we're all working together.
I think I would just say it's about kind of lifelong learning, and it's also about continuous improvement. So it's a continuous journey and a continuous reflection, thinking, changing, and it's going to take more than, you know.
It will be for ever.
And whilst it might take a long time, 1978 felt like yesterday.